Ukraine had turned Kerch Harbor into a naval prison before sunrise, without sinking a single major Russian warship. The Rapucha remained afloat. Both Karakurt missile ships still carried their weapons. Russian air defenses had destroyed most of the attacking drones, and yet the harbor could no longer operate effectively as a naval base. Warships could no longer maneuver on command. Fuel transfer had been suspended. The floating repair dock could no longer safely receive another vessel. By morning, Russia was not counting sunken ships. It was counting blocked lanes, interrupted refueling, halted repairs, and combat ships trapped inside the anchorage built to protect them. But that was not the real shock. None of this came from the attack Ukraine had originally planned. That plan had already begun to collapse. Only 4 drones remained, and the original targets were no longer reliably reachable. At 4:42 a.m. local time, 6 Ukrainian Magura 5.5C drones appeared on Russian radar several miles from the entrance to Kerch Harbor. They did not hide. 3 drove toward the harbor entrance, making themselves impossible to ignore. 2 moved toward opposite flanks, stretching the formation. The 6th, equipped with an electronic warfare payload, generated interference that cluttered the coastal radar picture and made the formation harder to classify. Russian crews reacted within seconds. Patrol craft moved forward. Heavy machine guns and coastal guns turned toward the waterline, while a Panzer S-1 scanned for additional threats. 2 Maguras were destroyed before reaching the outer barrier. A third lost its control link and drifted away. The remaining 3 continued along the outer approaches, keeping Russian patrol craft committed away from the harbor entrance. Within minutes, Russian command believed the attack was being contained. But the boats had never been sent to enter Kerch. Their real target was the emergency response their arrival had triggered. Anti-drone barriers began closing across the harbor approach. The navigation lane narrowed. Patrol vessels moved outward. High-value ships were ordered deeper into the anchorage. Inside Kerch sat a Rapucha-class landing ship, a tanker, and 2 Karakurt-class missile ships. Nearby were a floating repair dock, and the tugboats needed to move them. The anchorage was protected by layered radar coverage, Tor M2 and Panzer systems, Pol 21 electronic warfare, shipborne defenses, and physical barriers. Ukraine could not break through every layer at once. So it did something more dangerous. 6 unmanned boats had forced a base protecting hundreds of millions of dollars in ships and infrastructure to reorganize itself. The Maguras were not entering Kerch. They were making Kerch close itself. And as the harbor closed, Russia began moving every target Ukraine had come to find. Ukraine's real strike had not even begun. At 4:56 a.m., the final tug entered the inner anchorage. By then, Kerch looked different from 14 minutes earlier. The Rapucha-class landing ship had been pulled away from the outer berth. Steel tow lines tightened across its bow as tug crews watched the gap between hulls shrink. Harbor controllers issued short corrections over the radio, guiding the 100-meter hull through a confined basin. Nearby, fuel crews rushed to isolate the tanker's pumping lines before the ship could be moved. 2 Karakurt-class missile ships shifted inward, positioning their radar and close-range defenses around the cluster. To Russian commanders, the order made sense. Move the largest ships away from the exposed berths. Pull them beneath overlapping defenses. Close the harbor before the next wave arrived. But every successful maneuver removed more empty water from the anchorage. The tanker remained close to the repair area. The tugboats occupied the central lane. The Karakurts had to hold position to protect the ships now gathering around them. The space between some vessels had fallen to only a few dozen meters. Now 3 things could paralyze the anchorage. If one tug lost power, the lane could close. If the tanker caught fire, movement along the pier could stop. If the Rapucha turned at the wrong moment, nothing behind it could move. Russia believed it had made the fleet safer. Ukraine saw the opposite. The ships had not been hidden, they had been compressed. And when the final tug stopped, Ukraine knew the target was ready. At 5:01 a.m., Russian radar west of Kerch lit up with 6 Ukrainian Bober drones entering the engagement zone at high altitude. They were flying too high to be hiding and too tightly grouped to be accidental. That was the point. The formation pulled surveillance upward. Panzer S-1 shifted its search sector. Tor M2 crews watched the lower sector for follow-on threats. Pole 21 flooded satellite navigation bands with interference. Operators reacted as trained. 2 bobbers were destroyed. A third lost navigation, broke formation, and disappeared toward the sea. The remaining 3 continued west of the harbor, keeping Russian radar and air defense crews focused on the higher approach. On the screens inside Kerch, the defense appeared to be winning. But the bobbers were not the main strike. Farther south, 8 AN-196 Liutyi drones were approaching just above the water. They came from another axis, low enough to blend with sea clutter and far enough from the decoys to create a separate engagement problem. When GPS became unreliable, their flight computers shifted to inertial navigation and followed routes loaded before launch. Russia was not blind. Its radars still detected parts of the attack, but the full air picture never came together in time. The weakness was coordination. As each contact crossed a defensive sector, its track had to be confirmed, updated, and shared among Panzer, Tor, and the shipborne systems protecting the Anchorage. Every confirmation, update, and reassignment consumed seconds. At 160 kilometers per hour, 5 seconds carried a Liutyi more than 200 meters. Ukraine was not opening one large gap in the defense. It was crossing several smaller gaps before the layers could close. Russia was looking up. The real strike was underneath. At 5:09 a.m., 8 Liutyi drones burst out of the sea clutter south of Kerch. They had crossed the outer surveillance line before the southern track was fully understood. For several seconds, the gap stayed open. Then the Russian air picture changed. Operators identified the southern axis, updated the threat picture, and pushed warnings toward the harbor. Tor M2 crews shifted their engagement sector toward the southern approach. Panzer S1 lowered its search sector. Pole 21 increased jamming across the southern approach, while Panzer M systems aboard the Kerch-class ships began tracking the drones. For the first time, every defensive layer was focused on the real strike. The first Liutyi was destroyed by missile fire before reaching the harbor. A second lost navigation and veered east. A third was destroyed as it crossed the outer breakwater. A fourth disappeared from the attack formation moments later. Russian crews shouted bearings over the radio. Fire control teams reassigned targets as sailors on deck searched the horizon. Harbor controllers ordered tugboats to hold position and keep the central lane clear. 8 strike drones had entered the southern approach. Only 4 remained. That was not the attack Ukraine had planned. The original plan required several drones to arrive together against the Ropucha, a Kerch, the tanker, and the floating dock before the harbor defenses could engage them individually. Now half the weapons were gone and the survivors were arriving out of sequence. Russia had not erased the opening. It had destroyed the timing that made it lethal. Inside Kerch, the attack was beginning to look containable. The timing that made the original attack possible was gone. At 5:14 a.m., Ukraine abandoned the original strike plan. The planned route no longer offered a reliable approach to the Ropucha. One Kerch had shifted behind overlapping defenses. 4 Liutyi drones remained, separated by distance, timing, and interference. Ukraine had seconds to decide what still mattered. The answer came from the harbor itself. Operators saw tugboats holding the central lane. They saw the tanker beside exposed fuel transfer lines. Behind the fleet, the floating repair dock sat along the quay with electrical equipment and pumping systems exposed. The targets changed. Not the largest ships. The functions that allowed those ships to move, refuel, and return to service. One Liutyi turned toward the tugboat controlling the inner lane. A second was redirected toward the fuel transfer system. A third continued toward the dock. The fourth was held on a flexible route toward the infrastructure cluster. Inside the Ukrainian control room, bearings were checked and routes shortened. New aim points were transmitted whenever control links stabilized. It was an emergency rewrite inside a shrinking window. The first Liutyi descended over the lane and struck the tugboat near its machinery spaces. The blast cut power and left it drifting across the waterway. Seconds later, the second drone hit exposed transfer equipment beside the tanker. Fuel lines ruptured, alarms sounded, and pier crews ran for isolation valves. The third Liutyi never arrived. A Panzer M aboard one Kerch tracked it across the harbor and destroyed it before impact. The last drone crossed through rising smoke and turned toward the floating dock. It struck the dock's electrical and pumping systems, disrupting power and forcing operations to stop. Kerch still had ships. What it was beginning to lose was the ability to move, refuel, and repair them. The first emergency response made the harbor more dangerous. The damaged tug had lost propulsion, but it kept moving. Momentum carried it sideways across the central lane toward the fuel transfer berth. A second tug tried to reach it. There was not enough room. The Rapucha occupied one side of the basin. The Kerch held position on the other. Between them, smoke from the fuel area spread across the water. Harbor controllers issued conflicting instructions. Hold position, move clear of the tanker, open a lane for firefighting boats, keep the warships beneath defensive cover. Every order required space the Anchorage no longer had. On the pier, fuel crews reached the isolation valves and stopped the transfer system. That prevented a larger fire, but it also shut down refueling across the berth. Behind them, the floating dock had lost power. Its pumps stopped. Repair crews abandoned equipment and moved toward emergency generators that could not be connected while the quay remained unsafe. Then rescue vessels arrived. Firefighting boats entered from the east. A medical boat moved toward the damaged tug. Another patrol craft backed into the corridor while sailors threw lines across the water. The response protected lives. It also consumed the harbor's remaining open space. The Rapucha could not turn without striking the drifting tug or closing on the tanker. The Kerch could not move without surrendering their defensive positions. The floating dock could neither operate its pumps nor safely receive another vessel. Kerch had not run out of warships. It had run out of usable water. Missiles, radar, and hulls remained, but the space required to use them had disappeared. By sunrise, the explosions had stopped. The damage had not. Smoke still drifted over the fuel transfer berth as crews inspected ruptured lines, scorched valves, and water-damaged electrical cabinets. Refueling remained suspended until every connection could be tested for pressure loss and fire risk. That process would take hours, possibly longer. At the floating dock, emergency teams restored limited lighting, but the main pumps remained offline. Without stable power, operators could not control ballast safely, lift a damaged hull, or restart interrupted repairs. The dock was still afloat. Operationally, it was unavailable. In the central lane, tow crews secured the damaged tug before it could drift farther. But removing it required another tug, a clear turning circle, and cooperation from ships that had nowhere to move. The Rapucha remained intact. Both Kerch still carried missiles. The tanker had avoided a catastrophic fire. Russian defenses had destroyed most of the attacking drones. Measured one system at a time, the response looked successful. Measured across the harbor, it was not. The landing ship could not depart without assistance. The missile ships could not reposition without opening gaps in defensive coverage. The tanker could not resume transfer. Damaged vessels arriving later would find no functioning repair dock waiting for them. No single impact had destroyed Kerch Naval Base. 3 precisely placed impacts had interrupted the sequence that made the base useful. Coordinated movement across the inner Anchorage had stopped. The fuel lines remained isolated. Floating dock repairs could not resume. The explosions had lasted only minutes. The operational damage would continue long after the smoke cleared. Kerch had preserved its warships. That was not the same as preserving its freedom of action. The harbor still possessed firepower, radar coverage, and heavily defended hulls. What it no longer possessed was the ability to use them on demand. Ukraine had not needed to sink the largest ships. It had forced Russia to close the harbor, compress the fleet, and divide its defensive attention, then struck the systems that kept the Anchorage functioning. Even a strike package costing a few $1 million could disrupt ships, repair capacity, fuel infrastructure, and missile platforms worth hundreds of millions. That imbalance changed the meaning of Kerch. The consequences were no longer tactical. They were strategic. Future alerts could force the barriers closed again. Even a credible sea drone warning or an ambiguous cluster of radar contacts could trigger the same response, sending patrol craft outward and compressing valuable ships into confined water. The harbor had become predictable. Its emergency procedures could be observed, its defensive reactions could be timed. Its limited space could be turned against it. Kerch was no longer only a naval base Ukraine might strike. Kerch had become the target, not because every ship could be destroyed in one night, because the system could be forced to stop working without being destroyed. What mattered more, the trap that closed Kerch, or Ukraine's decision to change targets when the original strike plan began to collapse? Tell us below.